instruction 3 actually caused an exception. That's an assumption. Then what's the correct behavior to handle it? Because in this case, we actually have to finish execution up to this point of program, right? We now draw a line here, right? So we finish execution of these 3 instructions, but none of these following instruction must have any like effect on the pipeline, right? So that's our basic behavior. So in other words, it's like all or nothing, because all the instructions in this region must be executed, finish execution, and none of these instructions have any effect on the program state, right? So that's basically our goal. So here, this is a concrete example. Let's say we have 3 instruction program, and let's assume this one actually accessing invalid address like this, right? Then, as I said, because this one actually caused an invalid. This one actually has access an invalid address. We actually have stop. I mean, we will halt here, right? We're gonna halt at this point. So if you actually execute like this instruction in sequence in like a single cycle processor, you execute IR move instruction followed by RM move instruction, and you halt. Right? That's the correct behavior. And this one has no effect. This add instruction has no effect in the processor state. Right? That's the correct behavior. But the subtlety here is that actually this instruction sets condition code. Right? So if you think about this instruction sequence, in cycle 4 and cycle 5, this instruction now exception is detected here, right? Exception is detected in cycle 5 for this instruction. At the same time, this instruction tries to update the conditional code in EX stage, right? So this one is an example of a side effect because we don't really want this instruction to update the side effect, update this like a conditional code, because the correct behavior will be we only execute the program only up to this point, and we're gonna basically halt. That's the correct behavior. And this one is not executed at all. But in the pipeline processor, there may be some side effect. This one actually update this conditional code at the end of cycle 5. Then that's not what you want, right? So here, conditional code is set here. This is not the behavior we want, right? So we want to, we don't want this one actually has any effect on the program state. So that's the issue of like avoiding side effects. How we can avoid, side effect for those instructions that will not be executed in the pipeline, right? And so in order to avoid like side effects, invalid instructions are converted into pipeline bubbles, right? Because if you actually have like invalid instruction, they will be turned into pipeline bubbles, except that stat instruction indicating exception state. And data memory will not write to invalid address. That's kind of must be to protect the processor. We should not access invalid like address by using data memory. And also we have to prevent invalid updates of conditional code, right? So in other words, in the previous example, so how we can prevent overriding conditional code by mistake? How we can prevent that in this case? So we actually have to look at the earlier instructions in the pipeline, right? And any of these 2 instructions actually cause an exception, then we actually have to, we should not update the pipeline as a conditional code, right? So that's what this like bullet point is saying. So we actually have to prevent invalid update of conditional code. So we actually have to, detect exception in memory stage and disable conditional code setting in execute. If there's any like instruction causing exception detected in memory stage, then we actually have to disable conditional code. And they actually must happen in the same cycle. Finally, we actually have to handling exception in the final, we actually have to handle exceptions in the FIFO's final stages, like a memory stage and write-back stage. So when an exception was detected in memory stage, we have to start injecting bubble because we're gonna basically pipeline will stall, right? So once the accepting instruction reaches the write-back stage, then it's gonna stay there. It's a halt. I mean, it's stay there forever. And the next stage, like a memory stage, will keep like injecting bubble. I mean, just keep having like a no operation in the memory stage. So that's basically our design for avoiding side effects by these exceptions. So here's a control logic. May make a little bit of modifications to control logic. So here, this one is setcc. Setcc bit is enabled for those instructions that actually update a conditional code. It's a 1 bit like a Boolean flag. So if this signal is true, then we update the conditional code. If it's false, we don't update the conditional code. For example, move instruction don't update the conditional code, right? So in that case, setcc will be false. Otherwise, if you like add instruction, sub, all these like ALU instructions, they will actually update the conditional code so that this flag is true. So here, so setcc flag is true if the instruction code is OPQ. I mean, it's one of the OPQ instructions, then we actually have to update the conditional code. And what this condition state is, if there's no accepting instruction in the later stages, then we update the conditional code. But if any of the two instructions in the later stage, like M stage or W stage, cause an exception, then we don't update the conditional code. Okay, basically we guard our original condition with like this exception conditions. And also we update a little bit of stage control based on this bullet, this thing. So how are we going to handle these like exceptions in like the write-back stage and memory stage? So in memory stage, we actually detect one of these like exception conditions, like it's like an invalid address or invalid instruction or halt. Then if any of these conditions is detected in memory stage, currently like in memory stage or write-back stage, then in the following cycle we simply insert a no operation into the mem stage. Okay. The example here, let's say we actually have we have like 5 stages here: write-back stage, memory stage, execute, decode, fetch. We actually have 5 stages, right? And then here example is, let's say we have some instruction that actually accessing an invalid address. Let's say we actually have move. Okay, let's say we have some invalid instruction. Let's say instruction X, which is invalid. This invalid instruction is here, and let's say move is here, and add, sub, move, something like that. Let's say this is current snapshot of the pipeline, and assume this one is an invalid instruction. Instruction X is invalid instruction. Then what's going to happen here is, because now we have detected this invalid instruction. Actually, this condition is true, right? Because now in M stage we have invalid instruction. So in the following cycle, let's say this is cycle I, and let's say what's going to happen in the cycle I plus 1 in the next cycle. So according to these control signals, we're going to actually insert a bubble into the mem register, right? M register. So we're going to insert a bubble here. So in the following cycle, it will become nub, bubble, right? And also, this one will be actually propagated, but invalid instruction will be actually propagated to nub too, because in the previous slide, if you remember, invalid instructions are converted into pipeline bubbles, right? So in the following cycle, this one will be actually converted into bubble, and this one will just simply move on. Maybe this one will simply move on to sub, and This one will go to move, and so on. Right? This one will be the behavior. So the point is, these two like stages will just simply keep having like a knobs. I mean, only knobs, right? That's basically the behavior in this pipeline. In the following cycle, you know, if you actually have exception here, then you're gonna basically stall. Basically, you know, that instruction will stay in write back stage forever. I mean, it's stall, right? So that's how we actually stop the pipeline. So this is very simplified behavior because, you know, we assume, you know, whenever we have exception, we simply halt the pipeline, and that's very, I mean, kind of dumb way of handling exception, right? But in general, if you actually have exception, we actually do more sophisticated thing, like we show like error message, or, you know, we even show, you know, shoots like a blue screen or some like more, you know, sophisticated behavior, or sometimes we simply just print like a warning message and just move on. Sometimes, you know, it depends on how critical is the exception. So in general, you know, this is kind of, you know, general behavior of exception handling. So whenever you actually have exception, you first push the current or next instruction's PC into the stack. So this one is more like return instruction, return address. So exception handling, as I said before, exception handling is somewhat like function call. I mean, asynchronous function call, because, you know, it prevents you from executing your program. It prevents you from continue executing your program, right? It just stops your program and do something else and come back to your program, right? It's like, in a sense that it's more like function call, but in that case, the function is exception handler. Okay, so it's like, so as we did for like function call, we have to first push the return address, right? So we have to actually push the return address, and, you know, it could be either PC of the faulting address or next instruction. It depends. Sometimes you actually have to return to the current instruction and retry, then maybe the corrected behavior. Or sometimes, you know, you actually have to, you know, just move on to the next instruction. Okay. So one example of this coming back to this faulting instruction would be we didn't really cover this part yet, but maybe if you ever taken OS, operating system, maybe page fault. Page fault one is an example. Page fault is, for example, if you actually have page fault, that means the block of data you're looking for is not currently in memory. It's in disk. So in that case, you know, you execute like move instruction, but the data you're looking for is not currently in memory. Then first, you actually have to ask the operating system to copy the block into the memory. And then once it's done, you actually retry the instruction, then now you get through the instruction. So in that case, you actually have to come back to the faulting instruction, and you have to retry that instruction to, you know, to make a progress. In another case, maybe overflow or some benign exception. Let's say there's some like benign exception. So in case, let's say maybe like overflow, then maybe this like exception is kind of benign. Benign in the sense that it doesn't really crash your system, right? So maybe in that case, you simply, you know, prints out the warning, prints a warning message, and just move on to the next instruction. Then maybe the correct behavior, right? So, you know, depending on the type of the exception, you may actually have to return to the original like a faulting instruction, or you know, return to the next instruction to the faulting instruction. Okay. Of course, you know, the faulting instruction usually pass through the pipeline along with the exception status, you know, and then we jump to the handler address. It's like it's like a call, like function call. So you first push the return address into the stack, and you jump to the handler. And the handler address is usually like a fixed address. So there is some like gateway function, like gateway, like a same entrance for all like exceptions. And then the software actually, you know, first check the cause of the exception, and then, you know, jump to the correct handler. That's basically, you know, kind of dispatching function is there. So whenever, you know, we have exception, we first jump to the common like a gateway function, dispatching function, and then we, from there, depending on the cause of the exception, we the correct handle. Okay, and this address, this fixed address is usually defined as part of ISA. Okay. Questions? Exceptions? Any? By the way, if you remember this example, let's say we have 5 instructions currently in the pipeline, and the third, I3, actually caused an exception. Then the corrected behavior, as I said, corrected behavior was these 3 instructions must finish execution, and these 2, must not have any effect on the pipeline state. It's like all or nothing, right? So up to this point of program, everything is executed, and following instructions have no effect in the pipeline. It's not executed at all, right? It's all or nothing. So if you actually draw a clear line up to which point of program you finish the execution, and up to and then later to that line has no effect in the program state, then this is called, by the way, this is called precise exception. So precise exception means, whenever you actually have an exception, you have single point of restart. You can pinpoint single point of restart. If you can actually pinpoint a single point of restart, then that architecture actually support precise exception. Because exception makes your handle design simpler. Because whenever you have an exception, you just handle the exception and come back to the restarting point. You can pinpoint exactly where you restart your program, right? So in this case, maybe let's say this one is just like an overflow. You just print out warning, and then your restarting point is this instruction I4. Because in this case, this one is actually precise exception because we know where to restart the program. Then the question is, what is not an imprecise exception? So imprecise exception can happen in modern microprocessor because in modern microprocessor we execute the instruction out of order. So maybe I'm going to talk a little bit about modern microprocessor later. But modern microprocessor actually execute instructions out of order, meaning that there may be some instruction that may take a long time. Then maybe it's not ready yet. Then maybe you can execute a later instruction which is ready first. So you can actually execute the instruction out of order. Then because now you finished your execution out of order, sometimes you cannot really pinpoint where to restart because maybe instruction 1, 3, 5 have finished the execution, but 2 and 4 have not finished the execution, then where to restart, right? So that's called an imprecise exception. But so I'm not gonna deal with the more details about this precise and imprecise exceptions. But at least you understand what people mean by precise exception, because this is very widely used terminology in computer architecture. So sometimes some people say, oh, your architecture provides precise exception. Then if you can pinpoint where to restart whenever you have an exception, then that is called a precise exception. Otherwise, it's non-precise, imprecise exception. Okay. So let's move on to performance a little bit. So performance is a very important issue. So let's think about how we can evaluate the pipeline performance. Okay. So so there are many many factors that actually affect the performance of a pipeline, or generally any processor, right? So from what we learned, we know that if there are many hazard, it could be either control hazard or data hazard. If there are many hazard, we know that performance will not be good, right? So we know that, right? But we want in this part of the lecture, we want to quantify. We want to quantify the effect of this like bubbles. How much it degrades the performance of the program. So that's basically what you're gonna learn here. So there's like a so-called Ion law of CPU performance. This formula, very famous law introduced in 1980s. So there's like an Ion law of CPU performance. So here is this is the Ion law. So let's think about execution time. Execution time of your program. Okay, execution per, let's say, for your program. Let's say you have some like a execution time. Let's say in like a second, because it's like a word clock time, right? Then we can actually divide. We can obtain this like number by, you can break down this execution time into 3 components. Okay, so this one can be calculated as, let's say, instructions per program. Okay, so let's say how many instructions you execute. So definitely your execution time will proportional to how many instructions you execute, right? You execute more instructions, then your CPU will run longer, pipeline run longer. Otherwise, if you actually have execute fewer instructions, then execution time will be shorter, right? It's obvious, right? And then the second component is cycles, clock cycles, of course. Clock cycles per instruction. Okay, so this one actually measures how many clock cycle it takes on average per instruction. So it's like a CPI. It's called CPI. How many clock cycles it takes on average per cycle, per instruction. Okay, and the final term. Can anyone guess what is the final term? How we can get the execution time of your program? What will be the last term? Time of a second? Cycle, 맞습니다. Cycle time이죠. Cycle time. This is cycle time, meaning that seconds per cycle. Okay? So if you multiply these 3 terms, you can calculate the execution time of your program on the specific pipeline or specific processor. So this one, by the way, this one is called instruction count, of course. First term is called instruction count. Second term is called CPI, cycles per instruction. And third term is called cycle time, clock cycle time, of course. Okay, so in general, the execution time of a specific program on specific CPU, we calculate it by a product of 3 terms. The first one is instruction count, second one is CPI, and the third term is cycle time. So if you actually multiply them all, these one will cancel out, these 2 will cancel out, and these 2 will cancel out, and eventually you're going to have like a seconds per program, right? So basically it calculates how many how many seconds it's going to take to execute your. And this one actually gives us some insight how we can reduce execution time of program, right? There are several ways. The first way is reducing instruction count. So if you actually use like a better compiler, for example, or you use like a better programming language, then you actually end up doing the same thing with fewer instructions, right? So one way to reduce execution time is reducing instruction count. Okay? The second way is reducing CPI. So CPI means you reduce the number of cycles per instruction. Okay? So I'm going to explain how to reduce that. Maybe one way is, if you actually have more hazard in your program, then you have higher CPI, right? Because now bubbles, right? So one way to reduce CPI is reducing hazard. I mean, reducing the amount of hazard, or using like forwarding instead of like a stalling. Then actually you can actually save some like penalty cycles, right? So in that way, we can actually reduce the CPI, the average number of cycles per instruction, right? Finally, what will be the last way? And the third way is increase the clock rate, right? So in the current, let's say 1 gigahertz processor has a cycle time of 1 nanosecond, right? But if you actually run the same like a program in like a 2 gigahertz processor, you're gonna only have like half of the original like a cycle time, like a 0.5 nanosecond. So this will actually definitely reduce the overall execution, right? So this one actually only shows the two things. So here we assume the instruction count is the same, basically same binary, same executable without recompiling it. Let's say instruction count is preserved. So if you actually run the same like executable, I mean same binary, then the only thing we can actually control is these two things in CPU design, right? If your program is fixed, your machine code is fixed, then you can only control these two like factors, CPI and clock cycle time. So this one is like a clock rate. So generally, clock rate is measured in gigahertz, and desktop processors and servers are running at 3 gigahertz to 4 gigahertz range today. And in mobile processor, we actually have like a 2 gigahertz, around like a 2 gigahertz range, right? That's kind of a typical and popular design point. And this is a function of stage partitioning and circuit design. So how do you design the circuit, and how you fine-grain how many like pipeline stages you have. So if you actually have like more pipeline stages, then it's likely that you actually have shorter cycle time, right? Because now you actually did like a less work per stage. So now you can actually have more stages, but single stage does like a less work. So you can actually have like a faster, like a higher clock rate, or shorter cycle time. And second thing we can reduce is called CPI. So CPI is cycles per instruction. So CPI is a measure of how many clock cycles does each instruction require. Okay. So what will be the so it's a function of pipeline design and benchmark programs. And for example, how frequently our branches are mispredicted, and how many load user hazards are there. All these things actually affect the CPI. So in other words, CPI is a characteristic of program, and of course, and the architecture, the pipeline design, right? But CPI depends on the program itself. So some program actually have higher CPI, some program actually has lower CPI, depending on the instruction mix and the order of instructions, because some program actually cause more hazard than the others. So in that case, that actually has higher CPI on average, and so on. So let's focus on this thing. So clock rate is kind of we have to redesign the pipeline, also redesign circuit, which is kind of out of scope. So let's think about how we can quantify like this CPI thing. So in the ideal pipeline, what will be the CPI? If the pipeline is ideal. Ideal means there's no hazard at all. If there's no hazard, what will be the ideal CPI? Of course, the answer is on the slide, right? 1.0. Why is 1.0? Think about it. So every clock cycle, new instruction comes in, and every cycle, old instruction actually goes out of the pipeline, right? It retires, right? Steady state, every cycle, new instruction comes in, one instruction finished execution. So if you calculate these cycles for instruction for long period of time, on average, we execute one instruction every cycle, right? That's the reason why basically if you want to get like a CPI, you have to calculate the total number of cycles it takes to execute your program divided by how many instructions you have executed, right? But if you actually, there's no pipeline stall, there's no hazard, then on average you execute, basically new instruction comes in, one instruction comes out, it's like flowing like continuously. Pipeline actually flows continuously. So in the ideal, pipeline design, we actually have CPI of 1.0. Okay. Of course, individual instruction actually has a latency of five cycles, but here we talk about not latency, like how many instructions we can execute during the given like a period of time, right? That's what you are asking here. So in this case, CPI in ideal pipeline, the cycles per instruction is 1.0. But in reality, we actually have CPI higher than 1.0. The reason is because we actually have to sometimes stall or cancel branches, or sometimes we actually have like a load user hazard, right? All these things actually increase the number of cycles per instruction, right? So this is in practice, we actually have CPI greater than 1.0. So how can compute the CPI? Of course, here's a calculation problem. So of course, you can you know that it's very easy target for final exam, right? Because we actually here's nice like a formula and expressions we're gonna ask questions. So it's very likely that we actually have some like question asking about the CPI calculation. So here, let's say that we actually have C clock cycles and I instructions executed to completion, and let's say B bubbles injected. Maybe due to the load user hazard, or maybe mispredicted branch, or return instruction. There are some like cases when actually we have to insert the bubble into the pipeline, right? So the total number of cycles we spend to execute the program is number of instructions plus number of bubbles, right? That's basically total number of cycles we spend to execute this specific program, right? So actually, if you divide this C by number of instruction I, then the cycle count will be roughly, you can approximate this number as I plus B. Of course, this is approximation. So approximate it to be I plus B, and then if you divide it like 1.0 plus B divided by I. So this will actually quantify how many bubbles or knobs inserted per instruction on average. Okay, so this term basically quantifies how many bubbles are inserted per instruction on average. Okay. So if you actually have very frequent misprediction of branches in your program, then this one will be pretty high, right? And if let's say your program don't have any branch, and like there's no bubbles, there's no user hazard, no bubbles, and nothing, then this bubble will be 0, right? There's no bubbles will be inserted in your pipeline, right? So in that case, this one will be 0. Okay, so this factor B over I represents average penalty due to bubbles. So here's maybe more concrete example. So there are 3 cases we covered that actually insert bubbles, right? The first case was like a load user hazard stalling, and second one is penalty due to misprediction, like a JXX. Let's say we have a conditional branch, but we cannot really tell. You actually have the 2 cycles of bubble if the branch is mispredicted, right? So you get 2 cycle penalties, and finally we actually have the penalty due to return instruction. If you actually have a return, then you actually fetch the return instruction. There will be of like knobs, and then eventually when this one actually gets to the write back stage, then we can fetch the correct instruction, right? So whenever you have like a return instruction, you have to pay like a 3 instructions penalty, right? So that's basically 3 cases we actually have to insert the bubble. So first of all, let's say you have load user hazard stalling. Then let's calculate this B over I for this load user hazard. So to calculate that, we actually have to multiply all these three terms. The first one is fraction of instructions that are loads. Okay? So in order to detect, in order to calculate the average number of loads in your program, I mean, how often this load instruction shows up, right? So there's a fraction of instructions that are loads. And secondly, fraction of load instruction that requires stall, meaning that let's say using the following instruction is that actually use the result of the load, right? That's like a load user hazard condition. So the probability of the following instruction actually using the result of a load is like a 0.2. And number of bubbles injected each time this event happens. It's like just one cycle bubble, right? Assuming we actually implement forwarding. So if you implement forwarding, let's say we have load instruction followed by use instruction, like load and add. And then they actually go like this. And then when this one actually reaches like an EX stage, this one actually goes first, and this one actually stalls here, right? And then it forwards this loaded value into the input of the ALU. So we actually have to pay like one cycle penalty whenever we actually have load user hazard. So if you actually multiply these three terms, we get like average like a penalty due to load user hazard. So 0.25, 0.20 times 1. So this CPI penalty is 0.05. That's actually penalty caused by load user hazard. Secondly, we can do the similar thing. So here, the second term is like a penalty due to mispredicted branches. So how much this CPI is increased due to mispredicted branches? Then we actually have to calculate how often this event happens per instruction on average, because now we actually have to calculate this bubble per instruction. The fraction of instructions that are conditional jump is, let's say, 0.20. This is assumption. And fraction of conditional jump mispredicted is, let's say, the probability is like 0.4. And whenever this thing happens, we have to pay the bubble of two cycles. Let's say we have to pay these two bubbles whenever this event happens, whenever these two conditions are satisfied. So this penalty due to mispredicted branches is 0.2 times 0.4 times 2. So the cost is 0.16. That's the average cost. Average like CPI increase, caused by this mispredicted branches. Finally, we can do the same thing for return instruction. Fraction of returns are 0.02. Means like two instructions out of 100 is like our return instruction. And of course, whenever this this thing happens, this condition happens, we actually have to pay the bubble of like three bubbles for whenever we actually see this return instruction. So in this case, the penalty is 0.02 times 3, which is 0.06. So if you add them up, it will be 0.05, 0.16, 0.06. So net effect of penalties will be 0.27. So our real CPI in this example will be 1.27. In other words, on average, it takes 1.27 clock cycles to finish one instruction. Okay? So that's the calculation. 네. 이거는 그냥 가정한 건데요. 그냥 대충 가정한 건데 사실은 그 워크로드의 종류에 따라서 되게 달라요. 그러니까 예를 들면 우리가 게임을 하는 워크로드랑 뭐 워드 프로세싱을 하는 워크로드랑 그다음에 뭐 사무용 무슨 과학기술 계산용 시뮬레이션을 돌리는 워크로드랑 이 명령어의 믹스랑 이런 페널티 숫자들이 굉장히 달라요. 굉장히 다른데 여기서는 그냥 대충 그냥 예를 들기 위해서 숫자를 대충 잡은 거고요. 그냥 제가 그냥 숫자로만 봤을 때는 그냥 일반적인 데스크탑 어플리케이션에 나오는 숫자랑 비슷해요. 저 정도의 그냥 페널티는 숫자들은. 근데 그냥 여기 있는 숫자는 그냥 일반적으로 그냥 example로 그냥 볼파크로 그냥 준 넘버라고 생각하면 될 것 같아요. So question was, how you determine these numbers? Of course, based on measurement, you actually have to measure, actually run like a real code and profile it to actually get these numbers. And these numbers can vary widely depending on what kind of instruction, what kind of application you are running. Maybe it could be like a word processing or web browsing or scientific computing. They actually all different domains of applications actually very different characteristic of instruction mix, and hence this like number of this penalty and fractions of all these things. Okay. Okay. Last topic of this lecture is about modern CPU design. Of course, this modern CPU design takes, I think, it will take another semester if you want to cover, all these components one by one in graduate computer architecture. But, at least I want you guys to understand the basic ideas, the high-level ideas of how we can optimize the CPU design. What kind of optimization techniques are adopted for designing CPU today. So this one is very, high-level view. So there are two parts. Instruction control. This one is about like a fetch and decode. Fetch and decode. Fetching the front end of the pipeline is like a. My computer is about to restart. Okay, so this part is the front end of the processor, and this is back end of the processor. Okay, so front end is responsible to determine what is the next PC and where to fetch the instruction, and then fetching those instructions. This is responsible for the responsibility of the front end part of this processor, and back end part is basically really executing these instructions. Okay. So this one is more about, so this one is somewhat, it's more like fetch stage plus decode stage. And this is more about, execute plus M stage plus write back. Roughly speaking, okay? So we actually divide, these, two, parts, the CPU into two parts. So let's think about, this instruction control part. So instruction control is really important part like a processor design. So if you are familiar in Korean, there is like a jikse and takse. 이해를 못하는 세대라 가지고 sorry. jikse is about it's kind of the 뭐라고 얘기해야 되지? 그러니까 실제로 일을 하는 사람이 있고 앞에서 호객행위를 하는 사람이 있잖아요. 그러니까 찍새는 앞에서 이렇게 호객행위하는 사람이 찍새고 실제로 그걸 이제 물어보면 실제로 일을 하는 사람이 딱새. 죄송합니다. Okay, so I digress. So sorry for that. So there are two parts. First, someone who gets the work. I mean, this is like a fetch the work, and then second part is who actually do the work, right? So we can separate that too. In traditional Korean, it's called jikse and it's called takse. But there are two. The first part is about fetching the work. How can get to fetch the work? So if you really want to make best use of this your processing resource, it's really important to fetch the work as fast as you can, right? So so this one is about fetching the work. So in this case, the work is instruction. Okay, so the role of this part is this fetching the instruction as fast as you can, as correctly and as fast as you can. That's the goal of this instruction control design. So it grabs instruction bytes from memory, based on PC and predicted target and for predicted branches. In our pipeline design, we took very simple strategy. I mean, whenever we have conditional branch, we also mistaken, but this is kind of very simplistic design. But in more realistic design, you keep the history of the previous branching pattern. So let's say you track this the same branches, a branching pattern in the past n times. And then let's say in the previous n times, this branch was taken n times consecutively, right? Right? Maybe this one is taken in the previous history. It has been taken n times in sequentially, I mean continuously, then it's like taken, 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 and the next branch is also likely to be taken, right? You can predict that. So that kind of branches, based on branch history, you actually predict whether this branch is going to taken or not taken, and also branch target address as well. So hardware dynamically guess whether branches are taken or not taken. And in x86 architecture, instruction may be broken into multiple operations. So let's say in example of x86 64, as I said, this one is a CISC architecture, right? One instruction is very complex and very capable. But this one can be actually translated into this instruction, can be translated into multiple operations. In x86, this is called a UOP, like a micro operation, like a UOPs. And this is more like a RISC style instruction. So in other words, even though it takes like a fetch, like one complex instruction, internally it will be translated into multiple, like a simpler operations. So that this one is called like a UOPs in the Intel architecture. So typical instructions require 1 through 3 operations. If your instructions are really, really complex, then maybe it may take more operations per instruction. And also convert register reference into tag, but this one is about register, but I didn't cover like a register renaming, so I'm going to skip it. So this part. So let's move on to the second part, which is like execution unit. So as you see here, now we actually have multiple like functional units. So functional unit includes like integer operation, general integer operation, and floating point add, floating point multdiv, load and store. So now you actually have multiple, in a sense, multiple ALUs, right? In the previous design, we only had like one ALU, so every instruction has to go through the same ALU, right? But in this case, we have, depending on the operation type, we actually have like multiple instances of this like functional units. So depending on the instruction, maybe it actually goes to one of this, like dispatch to one of this like functional unit for execution. So there are multiple functional units, each can operate independently. So if you actually have like an add instruction and load instruction, then they actually run in parallel. Okay, so that's basically the idea. And operations are performed as soon as operands are available. As I said, this one is like an out of order execution. So let's say one instruction is actually pending. Maybe it can be pending because let's say the data you're looking for is currently not in memory, so you actually have to fetch the data from disk. Then it takes a long time to get the operand, right? In that case, you may want to execute like a later instruction first because maybe there are later instruction maybe ready already. I mean, all the operands are available, then they can start execution early, necessarily in program order within the limits of functional units. Meaning that in this example we have how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 functional units, right? So the maximum number of instructions we can execute in the same time are 6. Because we only have like 6 functional units, right? So this kind of limit like how many instructions you can execute in parallel. Control logic, of course, the control logic, if you remember, whenever you do pipelining, the correct behavior is, your program output must be same as if you run this program in sequence, in like a sequential version of the processor, right? That's the correctness measure of a pipeline processor. So this control logic ensures the behavior equivalent to the sequential program execution. I mean, you execute this instruction one by one. So this one is like a realistic, like a real parameter from Intel like a processor, which was about like 3-4 years ago. I mean, it's a design in 2013, so it's like 4 years ago. So but the internal the structure is more or less the same, but but this parameter maybe vary a little bit, but it's kind of the typical like a modern like a CPU design. So you can execute multiple instructions in parallel, like up to like two loading, one point like sub one, and two floating point multiply and one floating add divide. So in this case, you can execute 2 or 2 1, so it's like a 10, right? So you can execute like up to like 10 instructions in parallel. So in this case, CPI, what will be the CPI in ideal case? If you have a perfect pipe and all these functional units are being used at the time, so maybe the CPU can go down as much as low as, right? Because you can execute like 10 instructions at the same time if you have this assumption. Of course, you will never go like this low because there's some other like inefficiencies. I mean, so this is kind of theoretical minimum CPI, but you never go in this low. But if you only see like this one, that's kind of theoretical. Just looking at this like a functional unit, then CPI can go as low as 0.1. So sometimes some instructions take 1+ cycle, but they can be pipelined. So here's the latency and throughput. So load instruction, it actually takes like 4 cycles, but cycles per issue is 1. So what's the difference between what's this number and this number? The first number is once you start executing load instruction, it takes 4 cycles to complete, right? But what does this number mean, the second one? Because it's pipelined, even though it takes like 4 cycles, it's completely pipelined. So in the following cycle, the new load instruction can come into the pipeline. So this one is like pipeline interval. So how quickly the next instruction to come into the pipeline. So in this case, it's like a 4-stage pipeline, right? In this case, this one is like a 4-stage pipeline. Every cycle, new load instruction comes into the pipeline, but single load instruction takes like 4 cycles to complete. So this one is about like a latency, and this one about throughput. Okay. Integer multiply, it takes like 3 cycles, but it's fully pipelined. By the way, if you can start a new operation every cycle like this, if like cycles per issue is 1, this one is called fully pipelined. So fully pipelined means at every cycle you can take new like load or multiply instruction. Okay, so this is called fully pipelined. And integer divide, it takes like a latency is like 3 to 30 cycles depending on the design, and cycles per issue is also 3 to 30. That means this pipeline, this like a functional unit is not pipelined at all. Basically, in order to process the next pair of operands, you have to wait until the current one finish. Okay, so it's like unpipelined, this one. And double precision, single precision, floating-point multiply, add, they take some number of cycles, and they are fully pipelined. And double, single, floating-point divide, it takes like latency is 10 to 15, but cycles per issue is a little bit lower than that. So this one is more like partially pipelined, partly. Okay. So in Haswell processor, as I said, instructions are dynamically translated into UOPs, like RISC-style like operations. Each of which actually is like 118 bits wide. It's pretty wide like operation. And holds operation plus 2 source and destination. So it's more like RISC-style, instructions. Like UOPs are more like RISC-style. And execute UOPs with out-of-order engine. you know, the UOPs are executed when operands are available and function units are available, then, you know, it'll be dispatched to the one of this like function unit and, you know, executed out of order. Execution control by reservation station. I mean, I'm not going to talk about reservation station details, but, you know, this actually keep track of, you know, data dependence between operations, you know, in a sense that, you know, let's say there is some like a dependence between, like, then the cannot start execution until the first one finishes, right? So they're like a data hazard, right? So this one must finish first, and then, you know, that the second instruction can start, right? So that kind of like dependencies are tracked using a special structure called reservation station. And I'm not gonna, you know, cover more details about the reservation station, which is actually covered in graduate level computer architecture. But, you know, just remember that, you know, there's some like a special structure that tracks the dependency between instructions, producer-consumer relationship between instructions, and that's reservation station. And the last topic is about how high performance branch prediction, because, you know, the branch prediction is very critical to performance because it typically you know, takes a 11 through 50 penalty for misprediction. If you actually have like a deeper pipeline, then number of cycles you have to waste generally increase, right? Because it takes like a more number of cycles to get to the point where you can resolve the branch, right? So, by the way, this one was like a last year's, actually this year's graduate school entrance exam. So the question was, what happens, you know, if you actually have like a deeper pipeline, like you have more stages, in your, what is the impact on this like a misprediction penalty? That was the question of the, you know, the grad school entrance exam. So the answer is, of course, it increases, right? Because it takes more cycles to get to the point when you can tell whether this branch is taken or not taken. So it generally, you know, it takes more like stages to get there. So now you actually have to place more bubbles into the pipeline. So generally, actually increase the penalty. There are two like structures you usually use. First one is branch target buffer. So whenever you actually have a certain branch, you have to know the two things. The first one is whether this branch is going to be taken or not taken. That's the part one. And part two is once the branch is predicted to be taken, what will be the target address, right? So actually you have to know the two things, right, in order to predict the branch. First one is the direction, whether it's going to taken or not taken. You have to know the direction, and you have to know the target address. Of course, in our case, the target address is very simple because in our case, this target address is actually embedded in the instruction itself, right? Because in val C, the val C was the target address, right? But generally, it's not true because sometimes, you know, we jump to some like a register address, or, you know, some like, you know, so target address may not be immediately available when you actually fetch the data, because sometimes you fetch a target address from either, you know, register or memory, right? So if that case happens, you know, it takes some time. So it takes some cycles to know correctly what is the target address, right? So the first one is like first is this one is predicting target address if taken. Okay, so branch target buffer, it has 512 entries, 4-bit history, and adaptive algorithm. You know, it actually, you know, recognize repeated pattern. If it's taken, not taken, taken, not taken, then the following branch is, you know, predicted to be taken because it is alternating. So it can actually repeat some sophisticated pattern. If like branch target buffer miss happens, you know, it's detected in about like a cycle 6, like a 6th stage. Stage 6, and so predicted taken for negative offset, not taken for positive offset, meaning that let's say you have your branches here, JXX. So if you actually have negative like offset, meaning that like this, you know, let's say this PC is 1,000, and now you actually, you know, jump to like, you know, 900, right? Then it's like the offset is like a -100, right? Of course, it's like that's a hexadecimal number. So if this like offset is like a negative, then we predict is taken. And if it's like a positive, it has a positive offset, then we actually predict it's not taken, and so on. That's kind of the simple prediction scheme, because generally, if you actually have like this kind of pattern, this branching is usually caused by loop, right? Because you execute the loop. At the end of the loop, you evaluate the condition again, and if it's satisfied, you go to the header of the loop and you execute again. So this one is usually this backward edge. This is called backward edge because it's like going back to the older region of the code, right? The earlier region of the code. Going back is basically usually happened by loop. So this one is actually predicted to be taken. If you jump to the forward, it's predicted not taken, and so on. So this one is about like a loop. This is conditional. Conditional is if then else. Okay. This is also like a second part is branch history, tracking like a branch history tape, branch history, and there's like a special structure called BHT, branch history table. So this one actually, tracks the history of the previous branching patterns for specific branch instruction. Okay. So it will be like conceptually it will look like this. It's conceptually, but not physically. But conceptually it will look like this. It's like a table. This BHT is like a table. So it actually has PC. So PC is the program counter of the branch instruction, specific branch instruction, and here's a history. Okay. Then let's say you have like a specific branch instruction at address like a 1000. Let's say only 1000. There's like a JXX instruction. Then we actually have PC of this branch here, like 1000. Okay, and then we track the previous history of this branch, specific branch. Okay, then how we actually track this history? We usually have like a 2-bit counter. So this 2-bit counter is actually implementing state machine, finite state machine. So this 2-bit counter, this one is got strong taken. This is weak taken. This is weak not taken. This is strong not taken. So the idea is, let's say you start from this like a strongly taken state. And whenever this branch is not taken, you move to the right state. And whenever your branch is taken, you move to the left, right? And depending on what is your current state, it actually make a prediction. So if you divide here, draw a line here, and if you are currently in one of these two left states, then you predict the next branch will be taken. And if you are in one of these two states on your right, then the next branch will be predicted to be not taken. Okay, so that's the reason why it's called strong taken, weak not taken, strong not taken, right? Goes more to the end of this, like towards the end of either end of this like SM, then you actually have higher confidence because now you actually have like so maybe this history, maybe this one is got strongly taken, or maybe next PC, next to like branch instruction is like a 1100, and this one's like a weakly not taken, and so on. So using like this information, you make a prediction whenever you hit upon the same branch next time. Okay. So this one actually using this one actually we predict the direction of branch, whether it's going to taken or not taken, and using this like in the branch target buffer, in case of taken branch, we predict the target using this branch target address using this BTB. So each time the branch is taken, make a transition to the right. When it's not taken, make a transition to the left. You know, you predict the branch is taken when it's in the either state yes or yes. So it's like either it's a strong taken or weakly taken. Then the next branch will be taken, predicted to be taken. Otherwise, it will be predicted to be not taken. Okay, that's it. So this one actually summarizes the processor design part about the pipelining. So any questions about the exceptions and the advanced processor or CPI, anything we covered today? 네. 아, 거꾸로. not taken일 때 오른쪽이고 taken일 때 왼쪽으로. 잘못됐네. Sorry. Good catch. Each time branch is taken, make a transition to the left죠. 이거 right죠. Thank you. 네. 그죠? 이 state transition을 보면은 not taken일 때는 오른쪽, 그러니까 쉽게 얘기하면은 not taken일 때는 계속 오른쪽으로 가고 taken일 때는 왼쪽으로 가는데 똑같은 브랜치, PC가 똑같은 브랜치를 만났을 때 일단 여기서 뒤져봐요. 내가 거기 지금 브랜치에 지금 히스토리가 지금 저장돼 있는지 본 다음에 거기서 만약에 hit이 나면 찾으면은 걔의 과거의 히스토리를 보고 이제 프레딕션을 하는 거죠. 얘가 이번에 taken 될까 안 될까 이거를. 그죠? 이런 식으로 해서 브랜치 프레딕션을 하는 거죠. 그러니까 우리 지난번에 디자인은 단순하게 그냥 이게 컨디셔널이면 무조건 뛴다라고 가정하고 그냥 했잖아요. 그게 아니라 얘는 이제 브랜치 바이 브랜치 각각 브랜치별로 따로따로 히스토리를 기록해서 어떤 브랜치는 계속 테이큰 되는 브랜치도 있고 계속 안 테이큰 되는 브랜치도 있을 테니까 그거에 맞춰서 맞춤형으로 프레딕션을 하자는 거죠. 그게 기본적인 브랜치 프레딕션의 아이디어고, 브랜치 프레딕션이 중요한 이유는 아까도 얘기했지만 파이프라인이 딥하면 딥해질수록 한번 미스 프레딕션 했을 때 날려야 되는 명령어의 수가 많아지거든요. 그렇기 때문에 브랜치 프레딕션의 성능이 점점 더 중요해지는 거죠. 응? Questions? Any other? Okay, we have like three minutes left, so I'm gonna finish a little bit earlier today. So we're gonna start this memory hierarchy next time, this coming Thursday. Please be sure to submit your homework in time, like on Thursday. So we're gonna give out our like last, homework number 4 on Thursday.